Welcome to JCON!
Welcome to JCON!
Welcome to this talk about open source. It'll be a little bit pick and choose from other talks I've done, but let's see if we can make it a journey of contribution and collaboration. My name is Ivar Grimstad, and I'm the Jakarta EU developer advocate at Eclipse Foundation. And if you want to connect to me after or during the talk, these are my social media coordinates. So, open source then. How many of you are, I know we're not really super interactive here, but think about this, how many of you are actually consuming open source? And if I ask this in an auditorium, about 100% of all the attendees would raise their hand there. It could be using a library, a tool, or documentation, or whatever, but usually we are very much consuming open source in this industry. If I ask the other question, how many of you are actually contributing back to open source? That can be money, time, code, documentation, reporting bugs, or anything. That is usually a significantly smaller number. So this is how it usually is. We consume a lot, we don't contribute as much. And hopefully this presentation will inspire you to do more contribution and maybe look at different ways of contributing. So my first open source kind of physical contribution to an open source project was within Scala. It was in 2010, and I just had some time over, and I saw that they had this tutorial in English, and I didn't have a Norwegian translation, so I just translated it and sent the pull request, and it was accepted immediately. This is one example of non-code open source, and this is sort of a contribution where you actually do something or contribute something physical. Another example is I joined the JCP in 2007, and I joined as a member, and just by joining, I'm showing support of that organization. So just by joining a project actually shows support. So it doesn't really have to be doing anything other than just putting your name forward. So let's look at some open source principles so we kind of are on the same page. And there are 5 open source principles. The first one is about transparency. And that is that everybody has access to information and material. It happens in the open. There is no backroom channels or hidden talks. Everything is open. It's transparent. And this is something that is shared among all open source projects out there. And it's always about collaboration. And that is by getting together and doing something, we can enhance each other's work in ways we really didn't anticipate would happen. So the open source project can go in all kinds of directions, and this is kind of the effect of the collaboration part of open source. And it's always about freedom to experiment, learn by doing, and rapid discovery, figure out things that work and go with it, or throw it away if it doesn't work. So it's about releasing early and often. And it's about a meritocracy. And that means that good ideas can come from anywhere. And if you have lots of ideas, the best idea should win. And this is sort of, you earn your reputation by doing more. So the more you do, you kind of have more weight in these discussions and more responsibilities and more kind of what you can do. Ultimately, you can become a committer on an open source project, and that is something you've earned by contributing to it. And it's all about community. So it's to uniting around a common purpose, about shared values, and it's always about the community over the individual goals. So these are the 5 open source principles. There is also another aspect that is kind of the key to all within open source, and that is the user freedom. And there are 4 kind of freedoms that characterizes open source. and that is the freedom to run the program for any purpose. When it's an open source, we don't say you can only use it for this and that. It's for any purpose. And it's also, you're allowed to study how the program works, to change it, and make it do whatever you wish. So even if an open source technology was meant to do something, you can always do something else with it if it works. And it's freedom to redistribute copies. So you can always take a copy, fork a repository, and redistribute under your name, as long as you kind of comply with the licenses. And you're always free to distribute copies of your modified versions. So if you make a fork of an open source project, do some modification, you're free to distribute it further. And that brings us over to the open source licenses. And you can get a nice overview of all the open source licenses through the Open Source Initiative, where all the licenses are explained and what they do and what they don't. And one of the, I don't want to go into the licenses because that gets kind of complicated, but one thing that it's important to know is that there is a difference between open source and source available. So just because the source is out there and you can read it, doesn't necessarily mean that you can use it. So source available is about access to the code, but there are restrictions on use, or there may be restrictions on use. That's why you cannot copy something uncritically from Stack Overflow and just use it, because if you don't know what the license is, it could be a source available, so you're not allowed to use it, or you're not allowed to use it in that purpose you're doing. So source available is not the same thing as open source. And because open source is about software that can be freely accessed, can be freely used, freely changed, and freely shared in modified or unmodified form by anyone. So that's the difference between open source and source available. So it's kind of important to remember, just because you can see the source doesn't mean that it's necessarily open source. So let's look at some open source projects and different types of open source projects. And I'll start with the solo open source developers. It's one or two programmers come together, write some code, and put it on GitHub. And that's a valid open source project. And it can be either very easy or very hard, depending on how they're doing things to contribute to it. They can be very, no, I don't want to do, I want to let other people do it. I want to do it myself. Or they're very inclusive. It can be very varied. There are no really truth about these. It can be very responsive to support, or it can be literally abandoned. And there are different examples of these out there. Among others, Snoopy, which is an open source project I put out there. It's fairly abandoned at the moment, but I'm happy to bring it up if somebody is interested. Other things are, if you know these icons, it's about Faker.js and Color.js. That are very commonly used JavaScript libraries. And in these, the developer that maintained these weren't happy with how things were going, so he intentionally introduced mischievous commits. That meant that literally everybody who used it, their application broke. And so this is something that can happen with solo. So there are risks involved as well, but it doesn't necessarily have to go there. So I think these libraries are safe to use today. Then you have the single vendor type of open source, and that is where you have a company or employees as from the company that are contributing. And to get in as a contributor there, unless you're working for that company, is usually fairly difficult. And support can be very reliable because that company is kind of doing it. They may have a commercial product that is based on the open source product. So you can usually get good support from it, but it's hard to contribute. Examples of this are, for example, Quarkus from Red Hat. There are also risks involved with this, and I don't want to pick on anybody because this is fairly okay. But if you remember a year ago, so Akka changed their license from Apache 2 to Business Source License 1.1. So, and that is perfectly fine. They can do it as their business decision. But what it means for consumers of this is that from being freely able to use it, you're now under a source available license. So this was a change from open source to source available. And that meant that you would have to sign a contract with the maintainers of Akka in order to use it. And that is perfectly fine to do that business decision, but you have to be aware of it when you use these projects. Then you have the community-driven projects, and that is usually fairly large. They can be very welcoming, but less formalism around it. So they don't really have any kind of committer agreements or that kind of thing. But they're usually good to get in. There may be supports from companies backing it, or may not. It's more of the social thing. You're part of this group of people and collaborate on supporting the product. And these are usually very good projects. I remember using PowerMock, for example, a lot for a testing framework, and I think it's still out there and still works. But it the maintainers sort of dipped in contributing back. Maybe it's done. It's final. It's good as it is. It doesn't need anything or has been replaced. But with these community things, they may go away, just as with the solo versions. Then we have the foundation-driven projects, and these are formal organizations that are specializing in open source and open source projects that are usually critical to companies. And these open source foundations are usually very happy to get these companies together under a formal project. It's meritocracy based. It's very safe to use. They will never go away. And the companies participating will usually provide support, either paid or unpaid. And also there can be communities around it doing unpaid support. And examples of these are for example, Apache Maven from Apache Software Foundation, or Jetty from Eclipse Foundation, or Kubernetes from the Cloud Native Foundation. So these are examples of kind of stable, good projects driven by a formal organizations. But of course, there can be risks associated with these as well. And everybody remembers what happened with Log4j. So it can happen. It's not risk-free, but there is usually a fairly structured process around it. So that is the summary of the kind of there may be different versions of open source projects as well, but these are kind of the usual projects types of open source projects you will find out there. And let's switch a little to the evolving expectations from the community, from the industry, and everybody around open source. And it kind of falls back to the Log4j issue that security has come to become a very important thing nowadays. And I don't know if you remember SolarWinds a couple of years ago, where there were supply chain attacks. So it's not about vulnerabilities in your code. It could be the entire build chain may be vulnerable. So you need to have some way of kind of securing up all these the steps in the build chain, and make sure that your project is safe, not only from using it, but also from building it. There are also other things popping up here and there. How is this license compatible with this and that? And can you do this and that with this license? Do you have an SBOM, or what does this really mean? So how a vulnerability is handled? Do you have a CVE process, and et cetera, et cetera? This is kind of questions that come up from the industry, from the consumers of open source, that we somehow need to address. And the European way of doing this is to regulate things. And so the software industry has never been regulated in any way, but this is about to change. So I guess you've heard about the European Cyber Resiliency Act, or CRA, and that is something that is coming. It's being in the European Parliament, and it's something that will sooner or later hit us in some way or the other. And this is basically about CE markings for software projects. So if you put a software out there, you have to kind of certify it that this is secure, or whatever the criteria in the Cyber Resiliency Act is. And we don't know really how it's going, or what the result will be of it. So these are kind of just putting it up there that this is coming, and this is something we need to act on as an industry. And there is more. There is also the Project Liability Directive, and this is something that goes to great length to identify the economic operators who can be held liable for a defective project. So how will this affect an open source contributor if somebody loses money on a bug in their library or project? How is this going to be handled? Who is responsible for this? Who's going to be held liable? And this is a dangerous thing coming around us, and we also need to be aware that this is happening, and how this will be handled by open source. And it's not only in Europe. In the US, there are also ways of addressing this. But the difference between the European approach and the American approach is that whereas in Europe, we do regulation first from political hold, but with the US, they kind of tell, hey, industry, regulate yourself, or else we will do it for you. So they are kind of giving the industry a responsibility to address this themselves first, and otherwise they will pass some regulation. And whether it's a better or worse approach, I don't know, but sooner or later it will hit us as well from the regulation hold. And the US way is kind of the responsibility must be placed on the stakeholders most capable of taking action to prevent bad outcomes, and not necessarily the end users or the open source developer, but it's kind of the stakeholders most capable. And this poses a lot of challenges in the industry and in the open source community in particular. And these challenges are like the usual ones about user freedoms. That's kind of addressed by the open source principles and the licenses. We have the sustainability challenges that's kind of addressed by open source foundations and the structure around it. You have the security. We have all these regulations coming in. So all this is challenges that the open source community in one way or the other will have to address. And that brings us over to the open source foundations. And the foundation that I'm working for is the Eclipse Foundation. We have a lot of projects, I think this is fairly current number, but more than 400 different projects, whereas the Eclipse IDE is one of them. We have a lot of members, corporate and individual, almost 400 of them, and almost 2,000 committers. And there is a lot of code. And we have more than 60 people employed by the Eclipse Foundation. So we have staff resources. And we have this concept of industry collaborations where companies can come together and from multiple industries and work together to a common goal. And this is kind of a community-driven open source project with a business-friendly reputation. And we provide a vendor-neutral government to have this collaborative development of things and then compete on the specifics, but we collaborate on the open source. And some examples of these collaborations are Jakarta EE, which is the working group that I'm working mostly with. And Jakarta EE is celebrating its 5-year anniversary this year. Another example that you're probably familiar with is Adoptium, which are giving you a high quality downloads distributions of the OpenJDK from different vendors, tested and made sure that they are production ready by the Accurate testing suite. So if I should kind of sum up a little bit about what the Eclipse Foundation is about, it's that we're providing a collaboration platform, and we're also having a governance platform, and we have these services that we provide, like the infrastructure to do the collaboration, like mailing list and issue trackers and whatnot. We have an ecosystem for development, the working groups, for example, and the projects. And it's we have all the Eclipse development process and governance around it, and take care of the intellectual property, the IP issues. And we also are building up a supply chain security. So we're kind of taking care of this thing, and the members or collaborators at Eclipse Foundation compete on the products and services based on the open source platform. But on the open source platform, you work with your competitors to develop the best technology, and then you compete on the projects and services. Now with the changes coming, there may be need to add a column in this chart for the public policy to take care of the regulations coming our way in form of the CRA, PLD, and whatever the US comes up with. So we're also building up some resources now around public policy. And Eclipse Foundation, as a software foundation in the open source, is probably better equipped than most open source foundation, because we have the staff, the resources, and the practices around this. So this is just a matter of kind of adding a new service to our already existing platform. So if we look at the challenges to the open source community today, and how Eclipse Foundation can help with this, or foundations in general, is that for the user freedom, that's kind of where we've done and been for a long time, and that goes beyond licensing. It's just we guarantee this user freedom by just being an Eclipse Foundation project. You're guaranteed this. We also having this ecosystem for development. We kind of take care of the sustainability part of it. So these projects don't go away unless you really want them to go away. We have the supply chain security in place, and we're looking at how we can support the open source developers and vendors and companies contributing by taking care of this government regulation coming our way. So the impact on the individuals will be as minimal as possible. So that was a little bit about the open source foundations and the industry in general. Let's look at, if you remember, there's this disbalance between consuming and contributing to open source. Let's look at contributing to open source and how can we get people to contribute to open source, and what are you going to look at, and some inspiration around it. And so I've kind of, this is my formulation, I don't know if it is thing or something, but in my mind, the first rule of open source is to contribute. So all contributions matter. It doesn't need to be code. It can be, as I showed in the beginning, just sign up to support an organization. Have a sticker on your laptop. Just show that you're interested in this project. And it can be filing bugs or fixing documentations, translating, creating an image. It can be anything. So the next question is sort of, where should I contribute? Should I just go and open up the Apache Software Foundation project list or the Eclipse Foundation project list and just browse and see if I can find a project that has a cool name and go there? Or how do I figure out where to contribute? And the best thing to kind of answer that question is to look at the software you rely on in your daily work. So if you're using an open source library, and most of you are, for example, if you're using Apache Maven, why not improve Apache Maven if you need to see something? Why not help maintain that project or any other library you're relying on in your daily work? It could be a tool, a framework, a specification, a library, anything. So just kind of remember that we're not very good at contributing back. We're consuming a lot more. So look at what you're consuming and see if you can contribute and make this contribution icon bigger. And it does not need to be code. It can be anything, as I said, translations, documentations, or anything else. And the easiest way also to, other than rely on things that you're using and improving the stuff you rely on, is to follow your passion, right? If you're passionate about a project, it's much more easier to spend some time, because let's face it, most open source contributions, if you have a day job and doing something, is done either out of company time or in a limited amount of time you have. So it's much easier to do something or kind of convince yourself to do it if you're passionate about it. So I'll just show what I've been doing around there. So I've been, and as you see, I've been spread around the solo single vendor community foundations. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a foundation driven project or a solo developer project. You're probably easier to get into a foundation driven because we have all the stuff in place. But just jump around, figure out it. Don't pay so much attention to exactly what kind of project it is. You also, other than improving the software you rely on, it's another thing. Why should you contribute other than making your life easier in your daily work? And that is to improve your skills, because some of these projects out there, it's the best developers, it's the best code that you'll ever see, and you get an opportunity to work with these people and improve your skills by doing so and learn. So this is a training path. You can sell, if you need to sell it into your employer that I want to contribute to open source, and they ask why, and they say I want to be better. It's also about building your reputation and career. So in these days, probably the commit history in GitHub is more important than the CV that you're writing. So having a commit history to reputable open source project out there is good for your reputation and can be good for your career within your company, or if you want to move to another one. And that also brings us to how to contribute. And this can be different from project to project. As you saw, it can be very different from doing it in a single vendor, a community, or an open source foundation project. But one thing that kind of characterizes the open source foundation is that we usually have this kind of how to get involved and how to contribute guides. And I'll just use Jakarta as an example. On our webpage, we have this get involved and some tips and videos to how to get started to get involved in Jakarta. And most projects, at least as an open source foundation, have similar guides as this. And the easiest way is just support the open source by tweeting, blogging about it. I mean, maintainers, especially if they're the solo open source, always enjoy the publicity and you know the fame of being mentioned by somebody, a lot of developers. And why not, if we're all using Apache Maven, why not praise the people, the 10 people or so that are actually developing Apache Maven? That is something everybody relies on. Millions are using it, 10 people are maintaining it. So just showing them some support by telling that they're doing a good job would also be consider it as contribution to open source. So to sum up a little, the challenges to open source community is probably easier and better addressed within the open source foundations than in the other types of open source projects. We have ways of protecting the user freedoms and the sustainability and security, as well as regulation coming our way in the open source community. And remember, the first rule of contributing to open source is just contribute. And if you want to know more about the Eclipse Foundation, you can go to eclipse.org. If you want to know more about Jakarta-EE, which kind of close to my heart, is jakarta.ee. You can look at the Jakarta-EE Get Involved pages or similar pages at other open source projects that are kind of affecting your daily work and be a part of evolving the technology you rely on. If you want to check out what I'm doing around, you can check out my blog and find some resources there as well.